You are.
Cool. Guys, I think we're about to start. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Markus. I'm a debater from the University of New South Wales, but today I'm here to talk about principles in debating. Yay! My personal take on principles is that they're an excellent type of argument, and I think they're historically really underused, which is a bit disappointing. Because I think a good principle does two things. First, it can obviously be debate winning in it of itself. But I think the second thing to note about principles is that when you do them right, they're kind of beautiful in a way that I think practical arguments aren't. So I hope this presentation is going to help you have a bit more insight over the types of principles you can run, how you can run them effectively to win debates more often, and just generally to have some thoughts around principles even outside of debating. Before I start, I think two caveats. The first, well, I guess one caveat. But the caveat is this is just all my personal experience. These are, I guess some of it is my personal opinion. So two conclusions from that. The first that obviously some of it can be wrong, so take it with a grain of salt, think critically. But secondly, it also means that there are other ways of doing these things effectively as well. So talk to some other experienced debaters, you'll get more ideas around how to do principles that I simply just do not have the experience to do so. But cool. Broadly, there's going to be 4 sections in this presentation. The first is just going to be briefly talking about principles and debating what they are and what they aren't. Secondly, how you construct a principle and how you can do that effectively. Third, rebutting them, because sometimes you hear a really scary principle argument and you're like, oh, I don't want to respond to bodily autonomy or something like that. So that section will cover that. And the last is just some examples that you can steal, like some stock analysis that you could use later on. Cool. First section then, the hills you die on, what are principles in debating? So I think the easiest way to conceptualize principles, and specifically principled arguments, is by comparing the 2 types of arguments that can exist, or I guess the 2 most common types of arguments that are made in debating. The first and most common one is practical arguments. You guys would have certainly seen these types of arguments run because they exist in almost every debate. And I think most judges actually default to this type of argument, which is not great. Like maybe judges should be a bit more sympathetic to principled arguments. But unfortunately, most judges are consequentialists, and that kind of sucks. Principled arguments, on the other hand, are arguments that are built on a basis other than consequence. I think that quote there quite helpfully illustrates what they are. The ends don't justify the means. So even if something is really, really good for maybe in a consequentialist sense, maybe it's really good because you get a bunch of money, if it's unjust, then that's the reason why you ought not to do that thing. And the image here is I guess it's like an illustration of a very common issue called the trolley problem. And what the thought experiment is there's like a railway and it's going down a track. It's gonna hit 5 people, but you could pull a lever to switch it to the other side and hit 1 only. The question is whether or not you should do that. And obviously, the consequentialist idea is to flick the switch and kill that 1 person. But in doing so, you'd be directly involved in murdering that person. And that's the reason why it could be unjust. So, hopefully that illustrates what principles are. If there's any questions, happy to field them now. But otherwise, I hope that's relatively straightforward. Cool. The second thing I'll note is just that principles actually do matter. And this is outside of debating. I think there are a bunch of different intuitions that you as an individual are likely to have that are quite non-consequentialist in nature. I have 3 examples here, but there are a bunch if you just think about them, or if you just I guess you see them as you get to it. The first is the fat man's trolley problem, and this is a variation of the trolley problem. Well, there are a bunch of variations of the trolley problem, but this is the most common extension of it. And what it is instead of flicking a lever, you could push a very fat person off a bridge, and somehow that magically stops the bridge. The question is whether or not you should push them. And obviously, this situation is quite analogous to the previous one that I just talked about. You're still killing 1 person to save the lives of 5. So mathematically, it's the same. But I think if you were in this situation, your immediate intuition would be a bit of an ick. Should you push someone to stop the train? I don't know if an average person would have this intuition. I think less so than the first intuition, the most common variation of the trolley problem. But I think that also illustrates why things sometimes just aren't very consequentialist. The second example here is, I guess I call it the forced organ donation. And what the idea of this is let's say you as an individual are in a coma, you are in the hospital. theoretically, a doctor could extract all the useful organs out of you to save a bunch of lives and do it without your consent. And obviously that is good in consequence because you can save a bunch of people for the cost of only one life. So mathematically, that's a good thing to do. But should you do it? I'm not sure if the answer is very simple. My intuition leans me towards suggesting that it's probably somewhat immoral. Obviously, you can come to your own conclusions, but if your intuition is to be like, maybe we shouldn't forcibly harvest the organs of someone that's in a coma, then you could be also non-consequentialist as well. And the third is an example that comes from a book. This book is called The Ones Who Walk Away from Home and Loss. And what the book is, it's really just like, it's a fictional story of a very, very like excellent town. Like it's great to live in Omelas. Like there's no wars, there's no famines. It's quite good to live there. But the characters of the book find out that the city is essentially powered by a child that's trapped in the basement, and they're sort of extracting its life force to keep the city powered. And the question is whether or not you should, as an individual, walk away from that town knowing this. Because it is just quite good to live in that town. Like consequentially, you are just like torturing one child to like power an entire village, like making sure they don't have any famines or whatever. So that mathematically is a good thing. But obviously it's a bit more morally complex as to whether or not you should do this, and that is a good illustration of what like non-consequentialism could look like as well. So I hope these examples were useful to conceptualize of the different ways principles could be useful as an intuition. So, I'm now gonna do more of the formal debating stuff of like how we can like do it. Oh yeah, right. The second thing, in terms of the types of principles here, I think there are different types of principles and what they can achieve. The first is principal obligations, and this is like the highest form of a principle, in the sense that the aim of an obligation is to prove that something is morally necessary or required, or that you should absolutely not do it in any circumstance. And this is the strongest form of a principle, I think, because it explains that regardless of the like any positive outcomes, you should or should not do something. And obviously this is I think this is much rarer than the other types of principles, but if you can prove them, like it's pretty good for your case. I have some examples there, like things like bodily autonomy, freedom of religion, national sovereignty, are things that I think people lean towards believing are moral absolutes, in the sense that you should never violate these things under any circumstance. Obviously that's debatable, but I think that these are the more common examples that people pull on. The second type is closer to the center, i.e. like principle of benefits. And what that is really just a principle that is good to have, or it could be a harm. But essentially it is just something that's nice to have, but you don't really necessarily have to do it in all instances. And the example I have there is freedom of speech. Because most people broadly think that freedom of speech is a good thing to have. I think that's a fairly good intuition to have, like freedom of speech, yay. But there are obviously circumstances in which we are fine limiting freedom of speech. Like for example, like limiting hate speech online, anything incendiary or like misinformation during political campaigns, that kind of freedom of speech we are fine limiting. So that explains why in a lot of instances, freedom of speech is a good thing to have. It's a principle of benefit, but it's not all the time something that is obligated out of like society at large. And the third is principally fine, which is essentially just proof that something is morally permissible and it's not really like valuable one way or the other. And I think an example of this could be radical protests that I have there, in the sense that like if you were to make an argument about like, for example, eco-terrorism, where you commit acts of terrorism in pursuance of like an environmental benefit, like it could be justified because of like the urgency of like the environmental issue, but it doesn't prove that you should or you like have to even do these acts of terrorism. So I hope that is relatively clear. Are there any questions here? Cool. The third part of this is just to illustrate how these things can be used in debating. I think there are two ways of using principles in debating. The first is when you construct them as an argument in it of itself, where like that is the benefit or the harm. But the second, I think, would be in terms of weighing. Like you can weigh practical arguments to make them better if you can prove a principle. The example I have here is immigration. So in immigration debates, I think a relatively common clash is, this is really good for migrants and other individuals that come into this country, but it could cause some harm to the citizens in that state. a way you could break this tie is by proving that there is a principal benefit or principal obligation for the state to take care of its citizens first, which would explain why even if there was a benefit to the migrants that come in, and even if that benefit is really, really large, maybe we should prioritize protecting the citizens instead. That's just an example. I'm not saying I believe that one way or the other, but it's an example of how principles can be used to make practical matters seem more important. But yeah, cool. Second part then, building a moral fortress. How does one actually construct a principle? And I'll flag here that I'm not really super I'm not gonna try and force you to use a structure like this. I think these are all just useful thoughts to have when you're writing out a principal argument. Obviously, there are a bunch of different ways to do it, but this is how I tend towards writing arguments. Right, so I think the thing to note with principal arguments is that there are also arguments in and of itself. You have to have the reasons as to why something is true. You can't just say, this is a principle we care about, and then move on. Because otherwise the argument kind of just doesn't land. It doesn't really do much in the debate if you don't actually prove that. So a quote by Aristotle, I suppose, he probably said that sometime. In terms of the parts to a good principle, I think there are broadly three. The first is the hardest part, where you have to identify the principle you want to prove. And I think the ways you can identify this principle is, firstly, just in terms of intuition. I think when you look at a topic and your moral intuition screams at you to be this seems unjust, and you ask yourself why, most of the time you're able to arrive at why you think that is unjust or why that should be done. In a sense that you probably know what rights are being breached. Obviously this is just saying, you know what it is. But some techniques of identifying what you're specifically talking about are firstly by using intuition, in a sense that you can use thought experiments to identify different principles that could exist in a debate, or even analogous situations. I find that this is the most common way of proving principles, and I think it's quite an effective one as well, as long as you're able to draw the links there. But I think the simpler ways of doing them are the ones below. The second, in terms of observable situations, is sort of your intuition of it. Where have you seen this principle take place, for example? Maybe it's something enshrined in law, maybe it's something enshrined in a constitution. Could be useful to think of your own situations as well when you're coming up with a principle. And the third is just proving by first principle. And this is the most boring debatery one, where you just have to be why is this principle important? Why is this something that actually exists? And I'll give examples of the ways in which you can construct this later on. But you can genuinely just write out a principle by first principles, I guess. Cool. After that, after identifying the principle you want to prove, that's kind of the bulk of the work there. After that, you just have to explain why you either fulfill this principle or why the opposition breaches it. I think the useful question here is to ask yourself whether or not there's an exclusive breach of this principle on one side or the other. If you want to prove that you are fulfilling a certain benefit, for example, you should ask yourself whether or not the opposition can fulfill it as well. And I think the ways you can do this is just by being very specific with the principle you're actually talking about. Why is that principle being breached there? You should make specific reference to that. And the last step here is, after all of that, you kind of just finish the principal argument. You identify what it is, how you breached it, and then now you just have to explain why that is important in the context of the debate. And this is where all the normal weighing stuff goes, or the impacting, whatever. I think there are three different thoughts that you can have as to why principles could be important to your case. The first is when they are made as an argument, can they be debate winning in and of itself? Maybe the principle is just that important that not fulfilling it should cost the team a debate. But if not, to what extent does it pressure the opposition? In that even if it doesn't go all the way to winning the debate, it means that other issues in the debate matter less. If you prove that there's a practical principal harm of doing something, the practical benefits are less important. So it's a useful way of breaking the deadlock between practical and principal arguments as well. And the third way I think principles can be important in debates is by impacting your own practical arguments, in the sense that I think, for example, the immigration debate I explained earlier, by identifying that there's an obligation to your citizens, it makes the practical arguments on harming your own citizens more important. Cool, that was a lot. Are there any questions here? Because I think this is the most dense part of the presentation. Cool. Second part of this, just general tips for constructing persuasive principles in debating. I have 3 tips here, and it's kind of just vibes. Obviously, this is just things that you can I found this personally helpful. The first is that the interesting thing I think with principles and and moral arguments is that when you're presenting them to a judge, what you're really doing is convincing them that this was a principle that they held the whole time. Like you sort of just gaslight the judge into believing that the principle you're explaining is a moral position that they held the whole time. And I think by going into the debate with that like framework or that mindset, I think it's a good way of like making the argument more persuasive in and of itself. But the second thing I think to identify is that these arguments specifically have to be precise. For example, like when you're talking about the specific principal benefit or the principal harm, you should identify what the actual harm is. And I think I think the ways you do that is by just continuously asking yourself questions, right? Like if you're talking about freedom of speech, you have to ask yourself, in what circumstances is freedom of speech important and why is it important in this circumstance? And making your principle about that rather than the general one. Also drawing analogies to prove improving a principle, I think you also have to be specific in explaining why this specific situation is analogous to the situation that you attempted to prove. And the last and the most fun one, like I suffer doing this, I'm not gonna lie. But like, again, I think principles are about gaslighting a judge, to be honest. So being emotive when you're presenting them and picking the right words and like doing stuff like that is a very effective way of making principles more important as well. Because again, you're like trying to prove them of a moral position. So being emotive and like getting them on your side is very useful for doing that. Whereas if you like present it in a very like dry way and like the judge isn't really buying it, I think it's gonna be hard to convince them later down the bench that principle actually does land. So those are quick tips. Hope that helps in future debates. The third thing I would identify is how you would make principles stick in a debate. And I think this is a question that a lot of individuals ask. Like sometimes principles seem a bit silly. So this hopefully helps you to, I hope this helps like making them seem more important and round. And I think there are three things identified here. The first is doing explicit trade-off with like practical concerns and being directly comparative with that. I think the way you do this is like genuinely like copying it sometimes. Like if affirmative has this really, really good practical argument, the first thing you say in your speech maybe is, maybe affirmative do prove these things, but this isn't something that we're ready to trade off for principal concerns. So something's making that concession in and of itself could make your principle a lot more clearer than trying to combat that in the first place. But obviously, like it depends. Like sometimes it's not strategic to do that. Maybe you can with the practical issue as well. So kind of be judicious with applying this tip. The second thing I identify is actually doing the weighing of the principle. And like the thing I would identify here is that principal arguments are just arguments at the end of the day. You can weigh them like you do any other argument by asking questions like why this is important, how much does the average person care about this principle, and doing the normal weighing of like, this is why vulnerable people are affected, this is why the scale of the impact is very large. So applying those common metrics as well could be helpful. And the third, I think, is structuring your win path around this principle. And I think what that means is when you're trying to win a debate, for example, down the bench, like at first, second, or third, or whatever, you should structure your speeches around this principle as if it was a really important thing. Because I think the common mistake debaters make is just to plop it on at the end of a practical argument and expecting that to be the win path, when you should genuinely just spend a lot more time making the principle more important. I think the intuition here is that the more a judge hears about something, the more they're likely to think it's important and round. So if you structure your debate, your speeches around the principles that you're trying to prove, could be a useful way of making them land as well. So those are all the thoughts I had broadly around writing good principles, proving them, and making them seem important in debate. Now I'm gonna move on to like calling the opposition pretentious, what I titled it, and like essentially how you rebut principles, because sometimes it's a bit scary. So the way this section is going to work is I think I have like 5-ish rebuttals I think are quite common across all the different types of principles. So hopefully that's helpful. The first is just disproving the principle. I think this is easier than people like attempt, than people think. But like disproving that principle is real is possible. It's the best form of rebuttal in my opinion, because if something is untrue, then like obviously that doesn't weigh into the round. I just think it's a bit hard to pull up effectively. So be a bit be a bit careful when you're attempting to use this. Like sometimes maybe the principle is just real, but like, yeah. I think the way you do it depends on how the argument was constructed. For example, in the first part, when I talked about proving it via analogy or proving it via mechanisms, you have to respond to these specific parts of the argument there. So maybe to use a specific analogy, but why is it not applicable in this scenario? And I've identified what's called the is-ought fallacy. And what that means is sometimes there's a tendency to try to prove an ought statement using an is. Like for example, maybe like an example would be like, smoking is illegal, I ought not smoke. Like that's not actually a conclusion that you can draw. Like that's not a moral conclusion you can draw. And I think that's a problem with arguing from analogy. But the second thing is just like if the principle was proven using mechanisms, you can just respond to the mechanisms. And obviously it will depend, and I have examples at the back. But like just identifying the way the principle is constructed is very useful in disproving it as well. Cool. The second type of rebuttal is whether or not it's applicable here, in that I think most principles are not absolute. Like, what are the instances in which we discard a certain principle in favor of other benefits, for example? And I think the way to think about it is sort of the reverse of proving the principle, i.e. you use the same techniques to disproving a principle that you would to prove it as well. So use analogies, use thought experiments, provide counter-analysis, etc. And I think the example in free speech here is quite useful. So the defense of free speech is somewhat that it's like good, you know, like people ought to have free speech, people ought to express themselves. So the question is, in what circumstances do we limit free speech? I think there are actually quite a lot of circumstances where we limit free speech. We limit it when it can cause harm to individuals. We limit it in instances of hate speech. We limit it in instances of misinformation. So if affirmative doesn't specifically prove that their type of free speech is the important ones being defended, you can explain that those are circumstances in which we are fine trading off. Another example I think is democracy. People argue, and like in a lot of democracy debates, the principle is quite shoddily constructed in that people are like, democracy is good, but they don't identify the specific instances in which it is a right that people defend. For example, I think there are a bunch of positions that we don't democratically elect. I think for good reason as well, which explains why most principles are not absolute. You have to identify why in this specific scenario it's not a principle we should defend. I hope that makes sense, because I think this is one of the better ways to respond to a principle. Cool. Third rebuttal. Do they actually fulfill this principle? And I think the identification here is that some principle impacts are really just practical arguments but with like a hat. And the way to respond to them is just to respond to the practical arguments, because even if they prove that something is really principally important, if they don't get the outcomes that fulfill this principle, like they obviously don't get the principal benefit as well. And I think the best part about this type of rebuttal is just that it makes the discussion more about the practical outcomes as well, which I hope is a type of rebuttal that you are far more familiar with than principal arguments. But yes, you should then go on to disprove the practical impact as well. The fourth type of rebuttal is just whether or not you do it better. In the sense that if you don't disagree that something is principally important, I think there are other ways you can fulfill a principle as well. So for example, the principle I have here is the principle of reparations. And obviously in some situations it is important, and teams would use that principle to explain why we ought to recompense a certain minority group a certain way, for example. I think a way you could respond to that principle is by explaining that there are other ways of fulfilling the same principle as well. Maybe instead of giving them economic reparations, you give them political reparations instead. And I think the way you explain that this is better is by making that comparison yourself. So Alf wants to stand for economic reparations, you want to stand for political. Why are political reparations more important in the specific situation that they identify? So yeah, do you actually do it better? Maybe you could. The last type of rebuttal I think is the simplest, in the sense that, is this principle even that important? And I think the identification here is that, like all arguments, a principle is just an argument. Like you can make it seem less important in the debate. And there are two ways I've identified that you could do that. The first is by presenting competing principles and making your own principal arguments and making them seem more important than the other ones. But secondly, maybe sometimes practical matters are just more important. Like you can call that into question as well. So I hope those are useful thoughts in how like responding to principles. I think they're quite elegant, but the problem of elegance is that there are many different ways that like they could have issues. So yeah. The last part here is just pre-analysis. Like, here are some work examples of common principles that I think come up in debating quite often. And I think there are 4-ish examples, I don't remember, but yeah. First, the state power principle. And essentially what this principle is just explain that democratic representation is an absolute right. There are 3 premises to this. The first is explaining that the state restricts our freedoms. And I think this is quite an intuitive premise to prove. Like, you can't do a bunch of things because there are laws against it. The state takes your income by taxing you, and if you don't fulfill it, you go to jail, you'll send the police after you. So obviously they do restrict our freedom, at least to some degree. The second premise of this is that in most instances, you can't consent to this restriction. You are born into the state by the birth lottery, you didn't get any control of it, and opting out of the state is quite hard. Moving is quite difficult, it's quite expensive, you have to leave your friends and family, so that's difficult as well. But I'll note that the last thing to note about this premise is that most parts of the world have some degree of statehood, so you can't escape to Anarchy Islands or whatever, at least that's how the premise goes. The third premise is just to explain that as a result of the first 2 premises, this restriction is only justified by an individual consenting into the state or giving them some say into the way that they are governed. And often the only way to do this is via democracy. So conclusion then, democratic representation is an absolute right. That's the state power principle. It comes up quite often. There are obviously ways to respond to this, but I think it's a good starting point. These are some examples of motions that I think this principle applies in, could be used for argument in that instance. Hopefully you can read. Is that that's fine, right? So the first one is from Easters last year, I'm pretty sure. And a motion that we should establish a technocratic independent board to decide which taxes to implement from a target tax rate sent to the government. The AF can prove quite easily, I think, that the tax rate could be economically good or whatever, because technocrats are smart, whereas people could be dumb. But obviously that runs into the issue of not being very democratic, and that could be a harm you could explain is principally unjustified as a result of the state power principle. The second motion there, that military leaders should be directly elected by citizens, is another instance in which you could use this principle to explain why it is important to give citizens a direct vote in military elections as well. And I think that one came from Australs last year as well. Cool. Second principle, autonomy. There are 3-ish premises of this. Especially with autonomy, I think there are quite many different ways of doing autonomy, but this is how I would do it. The first premise is just to explain that humans are rational, conscious beings. I think this is fairly intuitive. A person can think, they can make decisions for themselves. They can weigh up the benefits and harms of an action that they opt into. The second premise of this is that this rationality allows for humans to assign utility and value freely. And I guess this premise really just means individuals can think for themselves, they can make decisions based on what they find important. And I think the framing here is to suggest that utility is not intrinsically valuable. People weigh up different things all the time. Maybe smoking is a net harm in most instances. Objectively smoking is bad, but an average could ascribe less importance to the health harms of smoking. But they ascribe more benefit to the high that they get off smoking, which explains that utility is only important in the instances that individuals give them value. The third premise is that individuals have a continuity of experience and they therefore suffer or benefit from experiences that they experience. So it's just people experience stuff and they have to deal with the consequences of the stuff that happens to them. So all that explains that I think that individuals ought to have autonomy, even if that autonomy is used to make bad decisions. For example, if someone opts into smoking, whatever. And the example here I have is from a motion in a mini last week. And it's essentially just the existence of a drug where individuals can change their sexual attraction. So I think a harm that the negative team could prove here is that this could be bad writ large for society or for individuals that opt into this. But I think the affirmative can prove on the counter that even if it is harmful, maybe individuals should choose for themselves, even if it causes harm to them. Maybe it's not actually that harmful to each individual opting into this decision. But yeah, that's autonomy. I think autonomy applies to other issues as well, in terms of state intervention, but yeah. Cool. Third, reparations. There are 3 premises. The first is that there was a historic injustice, something went wrong, and then this injustice caused some degree of harm, and that this harm still affects the present. and the conclusion is reparations are principally necessary as a form of recompense. I think this is useful in debates concerning minority groups. For instance, talking about why a minority group in status quo could be disadvantaged. Therefore, the state has an obligation to recompense them or to pay some degree of reparations. Or even in IR debates, where you're talking about colonialism, for example, identifying this and proving this principle could be helpful. The caveat I would make here is that this principle is very general, as some of the other principles we talked about, in the sense that I think proving that there is a requirement for reparations doesn't actually identify in what form these reparations should come. Maybe they could be economic, maybe they could be political, but still, I think good to know this. The fourth is special relationships, and this is not one of those principles that I that are like set premises, because obviously there are different types of special relationships. But essentially, the core of this principle is that some relationships, for one reason or the other, will cause, by the nature of that relationship, will cause some degree of an obligation or whatever. And I think the three different types of special relationships, there are probably more, but I couldn't think of any. The first is in instances where there is vulnerability or trust. For example, doctor and patients, or if you are working under someone. The second type is if you depend on that person, if you're a child, to your parents or whatever. And the third is if you made a promise to someone. The third one, I guess an example of that would be contracts or whatever. Cool. This is an example. This is an example of a motion where I think identifying that this is a special relationship could be useful in grounding certain principal harms or benefits. But I guess the motion kind of identifies that there is a special relationship. So yeah. Cool. I think that's all the examples I have, and I think that should be the end of my presentation. I hope that made sense. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. But otherwise, I don't have much else to say. Yep.
So, what would you use this as an argument for?
Right. Yeah. This was probably not the best example, but I think having an idea of what principal burdens could exist on both sides. If you read the motion, clearly this is an issue that could arise. So for example, I think the affirmative team could explain that in these circumstances, when there are special relationships, there can be more harm as a result of these factors that you identify. Maybe because you're more vulnerable as a result of being the employee of your boss, we should prohibit that because it can cause more harm. So identifying this principle is useful for grounding that practical harm, if that makes sense. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
When you're doing your heading for a principle, explaining what you're about to explain, do you think it's more strategic to be very broad, I'm going to show you why freedom of choice, or very specific to the topic and motion that you are doing?
I think doing both isn't necessarily a harm, in the sense that your first part could be explaining why the freedom of choice exists, and the second premise that you're explaining, or the second part of that argument, is just to explain the specific type of principle that you're identifying here.
No, of course, but when framing it, do you frame it as freedom of choice, or do you frame it as this specific, super duper niche thing? I'm going to do 3 things in my speech.
I think the more specific one is more persuasive. Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, have you got an example of a time either you've run or you've seen, a really effective principle in a debate?
Ooh, can you pause the recording? Yeah, so I think that's the best principle that was ever run in the history of debating, and I did it. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks, everyone.